Let's get right into this critical aviation safety update. We're looking at a massive shift in how commercial aircraft are going to be allowed to operate, and it's all being driven by the rapid expansion of 5G networks. Today's explainer focuses on a really important looming deadline in Canadian airspace that is essentially forcing the FAA's hand. This is leading to strict new airworthiness directives for Boeing fleets. If you're invested in aviation safety, fleet operations, or honestly just curious about how modern tech interacts in the real world, this is a fascinating and urgent issue that could very well impact the next flight you take.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start by breaking down the 5G aviation conflict, then look at Canada's strict July 2026 deadline, detail the specific flight restrictions hitting Boeing fleets, talk about the tolerant altimeter fix, and wrap up with the operational impact and next steps.
Section 1. The 5G aviation conflict and what we mean by radio frequency bleed.
So we have a real proximity issue here between two incredibly important technologies. On one side, you've got the 5G lower C-band operating between 3.7 and 3.98 gigahertz. On the other side, you have the aircraft's radio altimeter band, operating from 4.2 to 4.4 gigahertz. These bands are practically next-door neighbors in the spectrum. When you have incredibly powerful 5G broadband telecom frequencies firing off that close to the frequencies used by vital aircraft landing sensors, you get interference. It is literally like trying to listen to a whisper while a rock concert blares right next to you.
The crucial point to understand here is that radio altimeters simply cannot be considered reliable if they are suffering interference from those 5G signals. These altimeters are what tell the plane exactly how far it is from the ground during critical phases of flight, like landing. Without a protective radio fence, an exclusion zone around airports, that 5G noise just bleeds over and disrupts those delicate aviation instruments.
Moving into Section 2, Canada's July 2026 deadline and eliminating that buffer.
We've seen a pretty massive historical buildup to this moment. From 2021 to 2023, the U.S. issued multiple directives to manage 5G adjacent to the altimeter spectrum. In 2024, Transport Canada issued their own alert. But the real kicker happens at the end of that timeline. On June 26, 2026, the FAA dropped major new airworthiness directives because on July 1, 2026, the game completely changes up in Canada.
Exactly what happens on July 1st? Well, Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, or ISED, is implementing a huge regulatory change. They are completely eliminating the 5G exclusion and protection zones at Canadian airports. Gone. This limits any mitigations strictly to aircraft with tolerant altimeters and creates a much more severe interference environment for everyone else. Because of this bold move, the FAA is forced to act immediately to align U.S. operators with this new, highly restrictive Canadian reality.
Section 3. Boeing Fleet Flight Restrictions. This is where things get tough for the non-tolerant planes.
If you are operating an aircraft equipped with what is known as a non-tolerant radio altimeter, it is absolutely no longer business as usual. Before any flight into Canadian airspace, operators are now strictly required to review the limitations section and in some cases the operating procedure section of their airplane flight manual.
The FAA has broken this down by specific Boeing fleets. We've got AD 2026-13-10 covering the massive 747-8s and 770s. Then there's AD 2026-13-11 for the 787 Dreamliner family. And finally, AD 2026-13-13 handling most of the classic 737 series, with just a few older exceptions. Let's see what these directives actually demand, starting with the heaviest jets.
For the 747 and 777 fleets, the consequences are honestly pretty stark. Dispatch or release to airports in Canadian airspace is outright prohibited. Landings on runways in Canadian airspace, also prohibited. There's no gray area to navigate here. If you're flying a 747 or a 777 with a non-tolerant altimeter, you simply cannot land that jet in Canada after July 1st.
Now, the 787 manages to escape a total ban, but flight crews face some seriously intense procedural limits. Certain minimum equipment list items for brakes and anti-skid systems are prohibited. You absolutely cannot land on poorly conditioned runways coded 1 or 0. You have to factor in a longer landing distance using a 1.15 multiplier. Plus, it completely alters the workflow in the cockpit, requiring manual handling of thrust reversers, speed brakes, and the auto-throttle.
As for the 737 series, excluding some specific older 200 series models with SP-77 flight controls,
You're looking at strict new limitations for instrument landing system approaches, speed brake deployment, and procedures for go-rounds. Across the board, if that altimeter isn't updated, the workload and restrictions on the flight crew just skyrocket.
On to Section 4, the tolerant altimeter fix, and how to clear the airspace.
So what is the fix? Well, it all comes down to having a tolerant radio altimeter. This basically means the altimeter has proven it complies with the FAA's strict interference tolerance criteria. In everyday terms, it's a sensor robust enough to completely filter out or ignore the noise coming from the adjacent 5G C-band. It ensures the altimeter functions reliably no matter what those telecom towers on the ground are broadcasting.
Which brings us to the biggest takeaway for fleet operators. As the directive itself points out, modifying an aircraft to make it tolerant entirely removes the airplane flight manual limitations. It's basically the golden ticket. If your radio altimeter meets the FAA tolerance criteria, you don't have to worry about any of those additional actions, manual overrides, or flight bans we just went through.
Finally, Section 5, Operational Impact and Next Steps as we prepare for July 1st.
If you're operating a Boeing fleet that regularly heads to Canada, you've got 3 immediate steps. First, run an aggressive audit. Figure out exactly which planes in your fleet are tolerant and which are non-tolerant. Step 2, plan and execute the required AFM revisions so your crews are legally and procedurally compliant. And Step 3, strategically schedule those altimeter upgrades right now to minimize the massive operational impact of having your planes grounded or restricted. It's also super important to note that the FAA actually considers these directives to be interim actions. Regulators are going to be keeping a very close eye on the Canadian aviation environment once those 5G protection zones vanish on July 1st. They'll evaluate the real-world data, and the rules could definitely evolve from there.
Canada is acting as the catalyst right now, for sure, but they definitely won't be the last. As global 5G infrastructure expands and traditional airport protection zones inevitably start to disappear worldwide, we have to ask a big question. How long can older aviation technologies survive? And as we move deeper into a 5G world, is your fleet truly ready for the interference? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.